Hello, my name is Kai, and today I'm going to be talking about how Giovanni Van Bronckhorst fits into Liverpool. If you don't know, Gio is our new assistant coach. He's here to replace Johnny Heitinga, who became the new manager of Ajax. But before we get into it, it'd be amazing if you guys could like the video, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. Once again, thank you for 1,000 subscribers. I really appreciate it. But let's get right into the analysis. So immediately what we notice with Van Bronckhorst's teams are that the fullbacks kind of push up really high. And this is the Europa League final versus Eintracht Frankfurt, where it was Van Bronckhorst versus Glasner. Here we can see James Tavernier, who in this season I believe had 7 goals in the Europa League, the most out of any other player in the competition. We can see that he's very, very high and wide. You can imagine someone like Jeremy Frimpong here, maybe Mo here, the striker, Florian Wirtz, and maybe someone like Milos Kerkez. Of course, the actual left back's right here. But if we were to adapt this to Arne's team, it could be something like this. Because in Van Bronckhorst's team, he actually goes with a midfield 3 usually, with one of the 8s pushing up and the other 2 forming a pivot. Sometimes the 6 also drifts out wide to cover the space vacated by James Tavernier. What you can see from the next panel is that the ball is sent long to James Tavernier, continues to go long, and he receives it. This is kind of just to illustrate that someone like Jeremy Frimpong could also do this for Liverpool, and that may be one of the things that we are looking to extract out of Van Bronckhorst, his ability to really maximize fullbacks, especially fullbacks that are already very attack-minded. Okay, so here we have another scenario. This time we're looking at how Van Bronckhorst has his teams build out from the back. So in this case, the 2 center backs have really gone wide, where you effectively as the goalkeeper as the 3rd center back, a very well connected pivot. You have your 2 fullbacks who are close and pretty far apart, pretty far wide, and you have the other 8 in his midfield 3 a bit higher up than the 2 in the pivot. In Gio's teams, we often see him have his fullbacks much closer, much more defensive against better opposition, and against worse opposition, they're much more high and wide, similar to how we would expect to play next season. As we move forward, the ball goes to one of the center backs. You see James Tavernier start to push up, and in this case, the 6 actually fills that space like I was talking about before. That 6 ends up getting the ball with Tavernier much further up. The other fullback is much more reserved. You can imagine this dynamic between someone like Kerkez and Frimpong, because Frimpong's a bit more of a flyer than Kerkez is. Kerkez is more likely to pick up the ball and drive. Frimpong's more likely to run and have the ball meet him in space. So you could see why this dynamic would also make sense for Liverpool. And here we can get a scenario where the 6, and in this case if we had a more ball-playing 6 like Wharton, would be able to ping the ball in behind. It's very difficult to compare all of Van Bronckhorst teams to ours because they tend to be much more direct. They like these balls over the top. It's not to say that they don't do controlled possession, but they often go for these very direct attacks because they have players like Ryan Kent who are fast and are going to run into space. Here we're looking at the Scottish Cup final. The reason I chose this panel is because the 6 dropped between the 2 center backs. I thought this was interesting, and this is against weaker opposition, so the fullbacks are much further up. James Tavernier is out of frame, and the other fullback is pretty pushed up. The other member of the pivot's here. The other 8 is right here. So let's go one panel forward. Here we can see that one of the fullbacks has sort of dropped back in, and the reason he's doing this is to actually receive the ball. Van Bronckhorst is actually really good at creating these sort of patterns of play to really quickly progress the ball up, where you'll see some players drop in to then pass forward for another player to drop in, and they have these really nice vertical tiki-taka plays so that they can get a shot off in the box. If we go another panel forward, we can see that this is becoming a very associative scenario. You have 4 players really close together. You have your winger, one of the fullbacks. James Tavernier's pushed up, effectively acting like a winger, and you have your other pivot players and defenders. Again, sort of in the same region. We go another panel forward. The fullback continues to fly forward, and we get this scenario where the ball's coming in, or it could come in, and you have one fullback here, another fullback here, and your striker, which I think is very interesting because you could imagine scenarios where we'd have a striker here, someone like Flo here, Mo here, with your your quote-unquote fullbacks who are effectively going to play as glorified wingers. Again, most of what I'm trying to show with Van Bronckhorst is the utilization of fullbacks and how interesting it is and how different it is from what we've really seen Liverpool do. Maybe much more similar to someone like Klopp, because with Klopp you can imagine 4 players in the back line with 2 flying fullbacks and a midfield 3 that grafts, that kind of just does its job. But the difference with someone like Van Bronckhorst is one of the 8s pushes up further and you kind of get a double pivot with the other 2, which is much more similar to what we do, like how we set up. So I think that's interesting. Okay, here's another panel. This time we see one of the defensive midfielders get dragged out again. This is something that we tend to see a lot, and it's something I actually want to talk about as a potential build-up strategy for Liverpool, because once again, Tavernier has bombed all the way forward. You can imagine Jeremy Frimpong doing something similar. He receives the ball from the big direct switch of play, and he has a great crossing opportunity. So those are effectively all of the panels I really want to look at for somebody like Giovanni Van Bronckhorst. What I can really tell is the way that he utilizes his fullbacks is very, very interesting. So what you often get is one of the fullbacks pushes really high up. Another one of the fullbacks is a bit more reserved. You have your other players sort of running into support. So you have your other winger. One of the 8s tends to support, usually on the opposite side to the wingback. You have the other 2 form a really strong double pivot, sometimes with one of them getting dragged out this way, and you kind of get attacking situations like this. Like you get setups like this where they're very direct. They have one of their fullbacks here, a winger here, the other fullback. You get this very, very interesting asymmetrical formation. Maybe one of these players gets the ball, very direct. You could go here, player could be here, go for one of the fullbacks. It's very interesting. This is just what we saw from those clips. Now, I watched a lot of footage of Giovanni Van Bronckhorst teams in preparation for this video. I watched a lot of videos of Feyenoord, of Rangers, and of Besiktas, and what I saw is the patterns are very interesting, and the pressing is incredible. His teams tend to press very aggressively. You can even look up videos of Van Bronckhorst's pressing drills. They're very, very intricate and very, very intense. So I imagine one of the reasons we brought him in is because of his ability to create a better pressing structure, because I've heard even a lot of people talk about how they're a bit uncomfortable with the 4-2-4/4-4-2 press depending on the game. The way that his teams press is much more similar to Klopp. I've heard a lot of people give Guardiola comparisons for Van Bronckhorst, similar to how we saw them do it with Slot. And I've said that Slot is more like De Zerbi. Van Bronckhorst is maybe a bit like Guardiola in build-up, but in terms of pressing and how direct his teams are, the directness could be a consequence of not having technical footballers, but the pressing, it's nothing like Guardiola. But there's interesting build-up tactics. A lot of the time for Van Bronckhorst, you'll see some players like the quote-unquote left winger receive a ball directly from a center back and then lay it off to a fullback. Again, we could easily see this dynamic if this was Florian Wirtz and Milos Kerkez. Sometimes we also see a center back finding the fullback, as I've said before, and cutting it across to one of the wingers, who then finds a 9 in space. Sometimes both of these players converge in and they find a cutback to the number 9 or to one of the 8s. There's a lot of different attacking variations that Van Bronckhorst employs. Very, very interesting, intricate patterns of play. A lot of them do involve a long ball, but again, I think that's just a consequence of the level of technical footballers that someone like Van Bronckhorst had at his team. But that's just some basics and build up. I'm just going to talk about some of the statistics that were in Van Bronckhorst teams, some of the points totals, that sorts of thing. So Van Bronckhorst, for example, managed Feyenoord for 4 seasons. In these seasons, they got 63 points. They won a cup. They won the league. They won another cup. His teams were very balanced. They averaged roughly 2 goals scored per game, around 1 goal conceded. He really, again, like I've said before, liked to use his fullbacks to stretch the width. Against teams that were much worse, you would see constant scenarios where the fullbacks were really high up. And one of the 6s, and you would see the 6 get dragged out wide. You would get one of the 8s that pushes up. The other 8 sort of served as this connecting player. And you got situations like this. Maybe you have your striker here. You have an 8 here. You have another player here. You got a lot of situations like this that I thought were very interesting. Very attack-minded. He's not really a true Guardiola disciple like I've talked about. Feyenoord hovered around 52 to 55% possession. They weren't really dominant. They tried to control the game through structure, which I think reflects a lot of Slot, because Slot doesn't just try to control the game through possession. It's also through pressing structure and just overall defensive structure. They pressed very aggressively. I think they'd press well in midfield. They'd drag a lot of players towards the center and kind of just hammer them out. But it wasn't an erratic press. It was much more similar to Klopp than I think Slot's press is, especially at Rangers. But I don't think it was that level of chaos still. Don't get me wrong, Klopp's press was great, but it was fairly chaotic. It was very, very aggressive. Attacking wise, they were also very efficient, especially at Feyenoord. I like looking at his statistics at Feyenoord because they had a lot more really high scoring games where they would average like 15 to 16 shots a game. They had a lot of players overperform their XG. A lot of their fullbacks like Karsdorp at Feyenoord would whip in incredible crosses. They would get wide and be able to whip the ball across or low. It was something very, very frequently seen in his team. They had the best defense in the league, especially in 2016. That's 2016-17 season. They only conceded like 25 goals in 34 games. And if we now start talking about his Rangers team, that team tended to have more possession in the league. I do think partially it's because of how much more dominant Rangers are in the Scottish league in comparison to Feyenoord in the Eredivisie, but still very high possession, a lot of shots per game, great defending. They were high possession, high pressing. They were very pragmatic. Van Bronckhorst wouldn't always push his fullbacks up. Sometimes he would enter a more defensive shape against better teams, like in the Europa League final, like we saw. There was an obsession with crossing. In the 22-23 season, Rangers crossed the ball 455 times, which is mental for a team. James Tavernier was on fire. He got 6 goals and 8 assists in the league, 7 goals for a right back in the Europa League, like I talked about before. Incredible. They had very intense pressing stats. There were 648 recoveries, 142 tackles, and 45 interceptions in the Europa League. That was in their run to the Europa League final, where they played and beat teams like Borussia Dortmund and RB Leipzig. They had a lot of their defenders and fullbacks boasting incredible clearance stats, interception stats, tackle stats. They were a very, very aggressive, intense team that was built around very direct play and crossing and very, very fluid attacking and build-up combinations. So what exactly am I expecting Van Bronckhorst to bring to Liverpool? Because he didn't do a lot of these similar things at Besiktas, so I'm actually going to ignore his spell there. What I expect him to do is, he has, of course, a lot of experience as a fullback. He was a fullback. He scored an incredible goal for the Netherlands. We know these things about Giovanni. But with how we're building up next season, I think it makes perfect sense to bring in someone like Gio. So let's set up in the structure that we expect to be in next season when we're in possession. So what we'd expect is for both of our fullbacks to go high. We're expecting our wingers to tuck inside, something like this, maybe a midfield that looks similar to this. This reminds me a lot of how Van Bronckhorst plays. The difference that you might see is one of the sixes would go out wide. This is actually much more suited to someone like Adam Wharton. You would just maybe have to mirror it to something like this, pretend that's Wharton. This would be really good for a Bronckhorst team because when they were dominant, you would see both fullbacks go forward, especially at Feyenoord, more so at Feyenoord than at Rangers, because at Rangers it was more so Tavernier who was going forward, just much higher. I think for Liverpool you'd maybe see both. Maybe Kirkes starts here, picks up the ball, passes it to McAllister and then moves, but you would expect him to get similar statistics out of his fullbacks. We've brought him here because the job of our fullbacks next season is to play very similarly to Bronckhorst fullbacks, to have good intricate combinations, to progress the ball forward, to cross it into space, to be able to run in behind and accept the ball from one of the deeper players, like whether it's the DM or one of the center backs. You could imagine scenarios where Virgil van Dijk finds a ball to Jeremy Frimpong or to Milos Kerkez, or Wharton finds it to Frimpong. Even Ryan, we've seen him with time and space for the Netherlands pass an incredible ball like the one that Xavi Simons missed. So we've seen things like that. We could imagine combinations with the fullbacks to progress forward. We can also just imagine the general attacking combinations. Now, we haven't really seen the final stage of Slot yet, right? If you look at how Slot played at Feyenoord, they had these very intricate combinations. I think bringing in Van Bronckhorst only continues that. You can imagine scenarios scenarios where Ryan Gravenberch passes the ball to Florian Wirtz, who finds himself in space. Wirtz, because of how good of a footballer he is, passes it to Milos Kerkez, who then runs into space, and then you have players like Diaz arriving or Salah arriving at the back post. You can imagine those types of combinations. You can obviously imagine the direct ball to Jeremy Frimpong to Mo Salah, who just cuts inside and shoots, or then cuts it across to someone like Luis Diaz, who scores. Because of Van Bronckhorst's sort of ability to have one of the pivot players push up, could give someone like Dominic Szoboszlai the license to make these late runs into the box, either directly and being able to drive, or when someone like Frimpong has the ball, the ability to maybe run into the box and head it or strike it. These are the sorts of things that Van Bronckhorst gives you. He's actually much more aligned with Slot's philosophy than you may think, and he sort of represents the change in fullbacks. So maybe we would expect him to get similar statistics, again, like I've said before, out of the fullbacks. I think another really good thing that Van Bronckhorst gives you is, like I've said before, the pressing structure. Because what a lot of people worried about is how we're going to press next season, right? A lot of people, like me, assume that we're going to maintain the same pressing structure that we did this season, that we're going to go for the amazing 4-2-4, and if we're against teams that are much more midfield dominant, we're going to go with a 4-4-2. I think a lot of people expect this, right? And you could even imagine the 4-4-2 where maybe Salah is up and Szoboszlai drops into the right, but again, some kind of press similar to that. You could imagine it. I think with someone like Van Bronckhorst, you could get scenarios where we're actually pressing closer to the ball, that maybe even the wide men sort of push the ball into the center. Because we saw this a lot with Van Bronckhorst teams. You get a block of people who'd kind of converge on the center. If there's some player in space, maybe we get some more aggressive closing down. Maybe we get players to latch on better and press better. I think something a lot of people haven't talked about is how much more disciplined his teams were at pressing. So I would also look at things like that as a massive improvement under Giovanni Van Bronckhorst. Another one is he reinforces this idea that Slot has had where control doesn't mean possession. And his teams were very disciplined out of possession, where they could just sit in a low block or a mid block at times. Just sit back and force a worse team to, attempt to break them down with the ball. And then effectively what would happen is, you try to break them down, you fail, and then James Tavernier runs in behind, we counterattack, and suddenly we're in transitions. So Van Bronckhorst offers a way to continue the philosophy of control with or without possession, and maybe continues the development of our transition game, which we did see last season could wane under Slot, and maybe he continues it. These are the sorts of things I'm looking at with Gio, and I'm actually really excited to see where this goes next. I love the appointment. I know there were talks about us potentially getting someone like Dirk Kuyt. People were talking about Stevie G, Thiago as people that we could appoint, but I definitely think he would be a good option. And also, Gio's teams were pretty decent at set pieces too. Part of it was because of James Tavernier, but potentially Szoboszlai, Wirtz, McAllister, or Salah on these set pieces, maybe even Kerkez, could also produce better set piece statistics, although I don't really know if that would happen because the opposition that he was facing with his teams was much worse than what we'll face in the Prem. But these are the sorts of things that we can expect from Giovanni Van Bronckhorst, and I think it's an excellent appointment. Now, I don't think employing someone like Van Bronckhorst means that we're going to change shape like to a 4-3-3. Of course, he also used a 5-4-1 and a 4-2-3-1 in his teams, but he mostly used a 4-3-3. I don't see that, but maybe as a build-up shape, maybe we'll see the DM get dragged out wide. There are a lot of good ideas, and I do like the idea of bringing in a more experienced coach as our assistant next season. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Giovanni Van Bronckhorst. If you liked the video, please comment down below, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and as always, thanks for watching.